the question, I asked this question, and I hope you had a chance to reflect on Philippians 3. But the question is, when you think of the Apostle Paul, what comes to mind? They can be adjectives, doctrines, anything. His job, his personality, like Adrian gets to his personality. When you think of the Apostle Paul, what comes to mind? And you can, and like I said before, there's no wrong answers here, because there's so many opinions, so much written, that almost anything you say about him might be true. So, anything else? We had a few things: courageous, evangelist, grace by faith alone, intense, as you just gave us. Anything else comes to mind for everybody? All right, so I'm gonna go with a confession. So when I think of Paul, I think first and foremost, great thinker, first-rate mind, something like a modern-day academic theologian. He's at whatever school you want to say is the best in the world, right? For me, that's what comes to mind when I think of Paul. While I'm in the confessional mood, I'm gonna make a second confession. I'm a huge fan of this 1989 miniseries. For those of you who are younger than me, you probably never heard of this. For the people who are older, maybe you did. It's called Lonesome Dove. And for those of you who have never heard of this miniseries, it's about these two Texas Rangers and their kind of last great adventure in life, a big cattle drive to Montana. And so we're gonna play a clip from that movie, and then we're gonna talk about it for a little bit. Okay. Hopefully you can hear it. All right. Here we go. Oh, can you hear it? Can you guys hear it or no? Nope, no sound. Here, should we do? We could put a link. Oh, sorry.
Maybe you can put the captions on and we can just read it.
I still can't hear anything.
Can people hear me now? Yeah? Could you hear me before? Oh, okay. All right. So I'll describe the scene again. And the video is like stilted. I don't know why. Anyway, so let's skip this like illustration. So what the story is there's this newspaper man who comes and meets Captain Carl at the end of his journey, and you can kind of see some of the images. And he wants to get an interview with this like great hero of the American West, right? Who took out the bandits from Texas and who cleared out the Native Americans, the Indians, right? The Comanche and the Kiowa, they say. This wasn't politically correct, although in a certain way it was. And who did all these things, started the first cattle ranch. And so he says that to Captain Call, and he says to him, they say you're a man of vision. And so that triggers all these recollections on the part of the hero, Captain Call. And he remembered all the things that went on this last great adventure. And when they left Texas, they had 5 friends. He's the only sane and live person left on that trip. 3 of the friends are dead, 1's insane, right? And so he's remembering all the people that died, kids, enemies of, like, children that were enemies that they didn't mean to kill, a friend they had to hang, all these kinds of things that were horrible. So why do I like bring up this like little illustration, right? Because I think like what happens if there's 2 perspectives. There's a heroic perspective that the newspaper man has, and then there's the actual perspective, which Captain Call has, right? One about suffering and about trials and tribulations, failures, stumbling through life, things that were unintentional that now look like a plan, right? And I think that's often the way we read the Apostle Paul, right? We look back at a guy who wrote all these great epistles, and we think of him as someone who had a plan, right? Not as the person who was running for his life half the time, was failing a large percentage of the time, right? There's kind of the years we don't have letters are years where things weren't going well for him, right? So there's these big dropout periods from him, right? Where things aren't happening. And so part of the plan, here, I'm gonna read this because Taylor asked me to read it. So in the plea that the guy makes, and it doesn't work as well with the video, the plea that he makes to Captain Call, he says, they say you're a man of vision, you ran out the Comanche and the Kiowa, you started a new cattle ranch, you tamed Texas. And so I think we say to Paul, like, they say you developed the doctrine of salvation, right? We say justification, right? Salvation by faith alone. You invented the New Testament epistle, right? We come to Paul with all these things, and when he remembers the imprisonment, the beating, the Spirit telling him to go places he didn't want to go, right? These sorts of different experiences. And so the question is, how did we get to see Paul this way, right? And overlook how much his doctrine was active, wrestling with issues in a moment of crisis, moments of crisis when things were really hot, right? And we see him not through his letters and his sharp intellect, but not through the life he lived, right? Not the stumbling, sometimes failing, always on the run almost, right? And always reevaluating. I think that's a key point, that the things that he interacted with in his missionary journeys forced him to reevaluate his theology and what he thought was essential. And so tonight we're going to try to look newly at Paul and look as Paul, as Susan says, Paul as the evangelist, or Paul as the missionary, as a doer and not as a thinker. And to do that, we're going to begin, and we can use this quote. This is one of the quotes we sent out, and we're also going to look at Philippians 3 through 14. Would someone like to read Philippians 3? And you can volunteer and unmute yourselves, and then I'll pull it up myself.
What verses, Adonijah?
Philippians 3, verses 3 through 14.
Okay. Tell me, let me know if I'm not loud enough. For we are the circumcision who worship by the Spirit of God and in glory in Christ Jesus, and put no confidence in the flesh, though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also. If anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. But whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish, in order that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which comes through faith in Christ, the righteousness from God that depends on faith, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection, and may share in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, that by any means possible I may attain the resurrection from the dead. Not that I have already obtained this or am already perfect, but I press on to make it my own, because Christ Jesus has made me his own. Brothers, I do not consider that I have made it my own, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead. I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus.
Okay. So we're gonna, thanks, Jess. The thing to meditate on this week, the question was, what do you think brought Paul to the point where he was able to say that he counts everything as rubbish, right? All these, the list that he gives you, the Hebrew of Hebrews, the tribe of Benjamin, circumcised on the 8th day. What brought Paul to the point where he could say of those things that they're garbage, that they don't matter? Or maybe asked another way, what do you think is going through his mind when he gives that list of his bona fides, right? The things that he hangs on to. Do you think that was an easy thing for him to say? Do you think, what do you think he's saying is sort of like when you're on a diet and you're looking at that hamburger, you're saying, I don't want to eat that hamburger. Like, you're saying it because you're trying to let it go, but you can't really quite let it go, right? Like, does that make sense? And I can read that verse again. So, if anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. But whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. When he lays out all those things, do you think there's a part of him that still thinks that those are things of value, things that are valuable to rely on, or do you think he's completely let those things go?
So, yeah, I think those are the types of things that tug at him, because he was raised to find his center of gravity of who he is, of his identity in those things. And then he encounters, the living Jesus, and all those things that centered him now become decentered is a soft word, really, because the language he uses is much stronger. But I could imagine thinking of things that I hold on to, that those are still things that he has to put to death, crucify, put behind him on a daily basis.
I mean, so Ozzy brings up something which I like, it's kind of the value of Sunday school lessons. He said he encountered Jesus. He was accosted by Jesus and beat up, right? Like that's the road to Damascus. It's not that. Again, we kind of think of him as logical. It wasn't logic that convinced him. It was a somewhat violent encounter. He was knocked to the ground, the blindness, all the things that we know that we kind of forget about, I kind of forget about, right? Like, he's a smart guy and he knew the Bible well, and that's how he came to faith, right? That's not how he came to faith. He got hit upside the head, and that's how he came to faith. So I think that's an important beginning of how Paul gets to this point where he can start to count things as rubbish. And I think what we'll see tonight is that he continues to be accosted. And he continues to be beat up, right? By experience from this person who beat up in the first place. He's like, come on this trip, you're gonna get beat up some more, right? This is how Paul gets to his theology. This is a little awkward. Taylor's gonna jump in and maybe say a little bit on the same thing, but we're gonna kind of trade off because of the situation.
Do
So,
you want to say anything about this quote?
oh, so we'll continue my confession. Taylor gave me, he put me onto this book some years ago. I'll do it this way. It's called Paul and the Apostles' Journey. It's a very small book. I highly recommend it. And when I said, how I thought of Paul, it was before I read that book, right? This is kind of a narrative account of Paul as a missionary, comparing his epistles with what we see in Acts, right? So that there's kind of two accounts of Paul, which is very beneficial. I don't know if everybody does this. I tend to read them as two separate things, right? Like Paul's writing, and then we have these other stories, but you don't line them up. And so I'll read the quote. Paul was a very smart guy, as well as an early and particularly significant one. Consequently, Paul was on much more than a geographical journey in his ministry. He was on a theological journey as well. He learned things as he went along. Different situations, diverse people forced him to think things through. And I'll say this is, like Ozzy said, this is softer than what happened, right? Paul encountering Gentiles, the emphasis is going to be on force, right? He didn't learn things. He was being learned. Things were happening to him that the gospel was violently reshaping him. And that's why we start with that Philippians quote. Paul is saying those things as a person, as Ali said, was so invested in that being his identity, right? Like the process of his missionary journeys and his teaching was also the process of him being reshaped by the realities of the proclamation of the kingdom, right? He was seeing the kingdom that God proclaimed to him come alive, and he had to reshape his understanding of himself and his world and his theology, and ultimately our theology based on that. So we're going to do a little bit of that journey tonight and see where that takes us and see what that means for us as missionaries. And when we use the term missionary here, both people who are making disciples and being made into disciples simultaneously. So that's our project tonight. Taylor's gonna get us going.
Awesome. Do you want to share it from there, and I'll stop sharing from here? I'll move the mic over. Okay, so I really appreciate that those starting points from Addo for tonight, and it's helpful to have a chance to process together kind of your reflections on that quotation in Philippians, which like Addo, I mean, I've been thinking about that reflection, that self-reflection from Paul for a long time. So just to make some connection to what we did last week, walking through the whole of salvation history and seeing that there's a missional blueprint for God's people from the very beginning, from the very formation of that people with Abraham. We see that obviously climax in the life and ministry of Jesus, but then that ministry is imparted to his apostles. And just as Addo's already said, I mean, think about the commission that Paul received, right? I'm going to show you how much you will suffer for my name's sake. I mean, is essentially, Paul meets Jesus and then finds out that he's the most unlikely candidate on planet Earth to go and be the apostle to the Gentiles. But he receives at the same time the word that he's going to suffer for Jesus' sake. It's really gripping stuff. So we're gonna tonight focus in on Paul's life as an embodiment of that mission, and see that yes, he was a Hebrew of Hebrews, and he thought his experience as a refugee, as a Jewish refugee in Asia Minor, was a point of shame, but it was actually God was already at work in his life many, many years before he would meet Jesus, to make him the kind of person who could go on this wild and strange journey. So anyways, let's go ahead to the next slide, Anna. So we're really interested in like Paul's activity in we're going to look at a couple cities that Paul visits as kind of case studies of this. But before we do that, I want to just help us refine our approach, because this is not the typical approach to Paul. As you heard Addo say, we have this sort of theological reconstruction of his life, and it's very hard actually to try and retrace his footsteps as things were developing, as things were happening. But that's what we want to try and do. We want to try to bring together what Luke records for us in the book of Acts and what Paul shares or reflects on in his epistles to some of those places. So Adam's already mentioned it. Go ahead to the next slide. But there are some resources in this respect. So there's a couple recent biographies of Paul that we would put in front of you. So one is by a guy named Douglas Campbell, who teaches at Duke Divinity School. And the other one's by this little known New Testament scholar named Tom Wright that nobody's ever heard of. What I think is fascinating about the publication of these two books are, these are the kind of things that I feel like these titans of New Testament scholarship, their guild would not let them get away with this sort of thing. So they're interested, both of these scholars are interested in trying to marry the history of Acts with the writings of Paul, which is just something that it doesn't happen in the New Testament guild for whatever reason. And so I kind of see these guys, they're already pretty established in their careers. I see them like kind of doing this departure where they're like, now that I've got tenure, I think I'm going to write a biography of Paul, and if people get upset about it, or if my guild turns their back on me, I think I'll be okay. And that's kind of what we see happening. So what I want to do is just take as a jumping off point what Doug Campbell is doing in his little biography, which, if you're looking for the smaller one, it is the paperback smaller edition. Yeah. Tom Wright only writes things that are 400 or 500 pages, it seems, unless the publisher really threatens him. So Campbell reflects on a question, and I wonder if any of us have ever thought about this. But when we look at the missionary strategy of Paul, we know that, just from what we read in places like Romans chapter 1, or what we see him doing when he's going to different cities, is that the first place Paul goes is to the synagogue, right? First to the Jew and then to the Gentile. That's kind of his familiar pattern. Anytime he shows up somewhere, he's going to go first to the Jew and try and get a hearing in the synagogue. And so even last week we were looking at Acts chapter 13, watching Paul do this masterful sermon in a synagogue in Antioch, right? Which is going to look very different from what we're going to see him doing in Acts 17 tonight. But if that's his strategy, here's the question that Doug Campbell poses. Why in the world did he head into Europe? Why does Paul go into Europe when there's a lot more Jews in the East? So Campbell asked the question, why does Paul turn west rather than turning east? So if he's going to go to the Jew first and then to the Gentile, it makes a lot more sense that he would turn east of the Holy Land rather than west into major Gentile country like Macedonia and Greece, right? And Campbell's noting that Jesus is executed in Jerusalem around 33 AD, and within 10 years, his advocates are in as far-flung places as Macedonia and Greece. How in the world does that happen? What we see the church doing in the early parts of Acts is not putting together a strategy for reaching the Gentiles. They had to call a council to decide if they would even have fellowship with Gentiles. So what's going on that thrust Paul into Europe, right? He's not a likely candidate for this. He doesn't, he's spent his whole life trying to stay as far away from Gentiles as he can. So why in the world is he going into Macedonia? Does anybody want to venture a guess about that? Why does Paul turn west?
Because he had the dream.
Okay, say more, Susan. Say more.
Because he had a dream and God told him, in the dream there was a man saying, "Come to us."
Yes. Excellent. That's exactly right, Susan. In Acts chapter 16, Paul has a dream, the dream of the Macedonian man, and he says, come over to Macedonia and help us. Right? Paul has no intentions of, as far as we know, of getting into Europe and going to a place like Macedonia, a Roman, and ended up in a place like Philippi. Just to note, he gets to Philippi and he can't even find the makings of a synagogue. It's an interesting study. But that wouldn't have ever happened unless, as Susan said earlier, Paul wasn't filled with the Spirit. The Spirit prompted him to do that. So as Doug Campbell tries to make sense of Paul's, missionary journeys, he wants to propose that really the Spirit is leading the way here and fostering all sorts of breakthroughs, all sorts of places where Paul is having to push through cultural or religious barriers. Can you hit the next slide, Adam? So Campbell reflects on this because he's noting, like we do, that Paul ends up making all sorts of unlikely contacts. So Campbell writes, Paul, despite being a mature Jewish scholar living in Jerusalem in the shadow of his religion's all-important temple, traveled far from his home to convert low-status artisans, teenagers, women, and slaves from among all kinds of, Red Lobster eating, disgusting, uncircumcised pagans, right? All the kind of people that Paul's mom and grandmother told him to stay away from no matter what, right? Campbell continues, in order for these types of friendships to take hold, the befriender had to break through various barriers of gender, class, race, location, and language, to name just a few of the challenges. How did these strange friendships even form? When scholars look closely at the history of Paul's movements, they're like, in terms of what we know about Roman society in that time and how the Jews conducted themselves in Gentile cities, how is this even happening? Like, how could how could Paul find what he needed to make these kinds of contacts? So what we want to do, I kind of took that as a kind of hermeneutical key or kind of an interpretive lens for understanding Paul's journeys. And when you look at it closely, you see the Spirit showing up and operating in really interesting ways. So for instance, we'll look at a little bit later, Paul in Athens, and he's grieved over the idolatry of the city, right? We see later when Paul shows up in Corinth, he doesn't like Corinth very much. He's not having a very good time and he wants to leave, but he has another dream like the one where the Macedonian man is calling him over, and the Lord tells him, no, actually, you got to stay. I've got many in this city that you don't yet know. Many of them are my people, and you have to stay and find out who they are, right? So there's this, we can trace in Paul's career, his missionary career, this operation of the Spirit, forcing him to do things that, everything about his background and his culture would not set him up for, okay? So what, okay, let's move on a little bit. Yeah, let's move a little bit forward. Okay, next slide, Adam. Let's see where we're at. Okay, so I would just throw out these examples for you. Forgive the Latin here. That's for you, Tim, so you can just enjoy it. But there's a sense in which Paul doesn't adopt a uniform stance to these pagan cities, okay? So he finds himself in Philippi. There's not a lot to work with there, okay? Lydia becomes kind of the leader of that, it's like the unlikely, ad hoc spokesperson of that community. That's not at all been Paul's strategy in the past. He's kind of taking what's there and working with it. When he gets to Athens, as we're going to see in just a few minutes, he basically flexes his understanding of the history of that culture But when he gets to Corinth, he does exactly the opposite. So I think if we look closely at Athens and Corinth, it'll be helpful to kind of get that comparison or that contrast. Let's look first at Paul in Athens. We'll pick up in Acts 17 if you've got a Bible handy and you want to look at it. So you just saw a photo of the Acropolis there. Athens being the pride of classical Greece, right? And they're very aware of everything they have to be proud of. But when Paul gets there, what does he find? Go ahead to the next slide. So Luke tells us, now while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, his companions, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols, right? The city is full of, there's an idol for everything. There's an idol for this, there's an idol for that, right? So not only is the city very religious, and Paul's going to make that, going to actually applaud them for that a little bit later, but the city was taken with philosophical speculation. So we know maybe from the famous painting, but associate Athens with Plato and Aristotle, the school of Athens, right? The legacy of Socrates in that place. So as Paul finds himself there, how does he conduct himself? What does he do? Well, we see that he, verse 17 of Acts 17, I'm just going to try and drop in on some of these. We see that he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and every day in the marketplace with those who happen to be there, right? Some of the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers also conversed with him. So Paul, said about his normal strategy of trying to find God-fearing Gentiles and Jews awaiting the Messiah in the synagogue. Not much is going on there, but he's having pretty lively conversation in the marketplace, in the agora, right? And this becomes his consistent pattern, right, of moving on pretty quickly to the Gentiles when he doesn't receive a big welcome in the synagogue, okay? So eventually, I'm gonna have to come up with some kind of good hand signal or something here. Ado and I are just in the podcast studio tonight, so we need some callers though, like people to call in. So Paul takes that strategy of just trying to converse, just trying to make himself available to anyone that's willing to engage with him. Eventually, he gets the attention of the ruling authorities in that place. And so I'm sure you've heard about his time spent on the Areopagus, or what we call Mars Hill. Here's a photo of it so you can see what it kind of looks like. Often we associate this place with the philosophers that Paul would have been engaging with. And so lots of different things are named after this place, Mars Hill. There's schools and churches and podcasts and all sorts of things are named after this. What's really interesting though, and this came out in the biography that Tom Wright did of Paul, was Tom Wright really wanted to make some corrections here, because often we make this association and think of the Areopagus or Mars Hill as some sort of like philosophy club or some sort of debate platform where people would propose novel ideas. Tom Wright actually says we need to slow down and look at how Mars Hill or the Areopagus functioned in the city of Athens. It was much more like a kind of city council. So when Paul, yeah, go ahead. So when Paul gets the invitation to come before the council on Mars Hill, it's kind of a touch and go moment, right? They're not just interested in hearing some novel ideas. They're aware that what Paul's teaching every day in the marketplace has consequences for how they govern their city. So that, yes, there's lots of rich traditions of philosophy happening, but if you remember, what did Socrates get killed for? I mean, or what did Socrates get taken out? Does anybody want to refresh our memory as to why Socrates was didn't get to go on living?
For corrupting the youth.
Yes, and what was he? I mean, he was corrupting them to make them critical thinkers. What was the rest of that charge, though? You're exactly right, Ozzy.
I don't remember.
Oh, okay. Tim?
Yeah, so he was accused also of something Paul was accused of telling them to not worship the gods.
Yes. Yeah. So even that's you guys are both right. That is the charge that was leveled against him, right? So even though this is a place of a lot of learning, it was also a place of great superstition. And you do not want to anger the gods. So, okay, so let's pick up here Acts 17, verses 22 and 23. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you." Now, this is a really interesting moment. And for the most part, I don't know about your experience, but reading this, there's like a hint of irony, Paul's kind of got his tongue in his cheek. He's like, yeah, I perceive that you guys were really religious. I mean, you've got to think it, that's a natural thought, I think, because, what is it that the people of God, what's their great crime in the Old Testament? Their idolatry, right? So Paul, as a Hebrew of Hebrews, would have been really wary of all this idolatry. So sometimes we read that and we think, ooh, but I would just I would propose to you that I don't think Paul is just blowing smoke here. I think he's picking up on something pretty valuable. So hit the next slide, Adam. Yeah, this is the shrine to the unknown God, the agonistos theos, the unknown God, right? So this, like, archaeologists have actually discovered this. And so when Paul picks up on their concern to completely cover their bases, I don't think he's being facetious. I don't think he's trying to kind of subtly or covertly insult them, right? I think he's saying, like, hey, there is, at least in your perspective on what's true and real in the world, there's a little bit of margin for error, because you guys are concerned that there might be a God that you haven't addressed. There might be a God out there that you haven't that you don't have clarity on who that is, right? And so Paul, instead of condemning them for their idolatry, he actually commends them for leaving a little bit of space for what they don't know. Which, I don't know. I mean, it's probably worth just like pausing there to think about, like, how in the world would could Paul get to the point where he he would praise them rather than condemn them. How's that hitting you guys tonight? What does that sound like to you?
I think it was really smart. He picked up on something already in their culture. And apparently that's a good missionary strategy in all kinds of cultures, and it's worked in a lot of cultures, to find something that is true and build on that. And then the people can relate to that so much better.
Yeah. Anybody else? I mean, have you thought about it from that perspective before? I know. Adrian, are you chiming in? We couldn't tell. Oh, we can't hear you. Maybe it's the AirPod thing.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, well, there you are. There you are. Can you hear us?
Oh, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
So I was a little unclear about what you're asking us. Have we thought about what exactly his approach, or the fact that he
Yeah,
was sarcastic, or I'm not following?
yeah. Have we thought about maybe that Paul is actually making a positive commentary about Athens here, and not simply a negative or a veiled, criticism of them? That was kind of what I was getting at.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think that makes sense. I mean, especially since, I mean, he's on a mission, right? I mean, why would he? I don't know. On some level, why would you want to insult the people who you're trying to appeal to? I don't know. I guess I never thought about Paul's being. I know he can be bold and he can actually be very harsh, but and I know he said other things in other epistles that were obviously very, I don't know. I guess violent, but I never thought of him as sarcastic. But maybe I just don't know that part of him as well as I should.
Yeah, yeah. He's got range, that's for sure. he, he can still surprise us. Well, let me go ahead and try and, so when we see Paul, these are the steps leading up to the Areopagus. Let me just make some concluding points about Paul in Athens. So this isn't simple flattery. He is a bit, I think, probably concerned for his well-being, being called to account. The elders of the city of Athens, their primary concern is not whether what Paul is teaching is actually true or not. They don't like what he has to say about the resurrection. Obviously, if you keep reading, their concern is if there's a God out there that they haven't created a shrine for, then they've got to get some building permits passed. They've got to rezone. They've got to put a new shrine up. So that's kind of their perspective. They're thinking a very kind of municipal kind of leadership of the city sort of sense, right? But what Paul does in that moment that he has their attention is he does commend them. He finds it within himself to overcome the disgust over their idolatry and actually commend them. When we look at Paul's background, it's helpful to note that Tarsus, where he grew up, was another center of ancient learning in the Mediterranean world. And when you look closely at Paul's writings, there are 200 separate parallels in his writings that sometimes are quotations, like we see him doing there in the sermon, actually quoting their poets back to them, but quotations, allusions, references throughout Paul's writings. So he's very familiar with authors like Aristotle, Cicero, Hesiod, Marcus Aurelius, Homer. These would be some of the the writers that would get referenced or cited in his writings. Here in his speech on the Areopagus, he is very careful to tailor what he says to his listeners to both encourage connection between his message and what Stoics believed, and encourage, so for instance, the Stoics held that the gods were immortal. Paul mentions that the God he represents is immortal, right? they value judgment, divine providence. This is kind of part of the Stoic worldview. Paul amplifies those aspects of his own theology with them. When at the same time he's addressing the Epicurean philosophers, and they didn't think that sacrifices or temples were of any value. Well, Paul says, the God that I represent doesn't dwell in temples and is not served by human hands, right? So what we see here is kind of Paul coming into a very hostile, like religiously hostile, culturally hostile setting, and somehow, I think prompted by the Spirit, able to discern there's something here that I can work with, right? And latching onto that altar to the unknown God gives him an entry point to share the same gospel that he's sharing in Acts 13, but using, very different reference points that this audience would understand, that the synagogue audience wouldn't understand. So I'm going to pause there before we look at Corinth and see if folks have questions. You see any questions? I'd imagine. Seeing none, we'll move on. I think it's helpful to see Paul's missionary strategy in Athens, even in greater, with sort of greater precision when we put it alongside the next place that Paul goes. Paul heads to Corinth. Now, before, we all know a lot about Athens. We've seen pictures of it. We had introduction to philosophy, and studied Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. So we're familiar with Athens. Corinth requires a little bit more background, especially Corinth in the time that Paul is visiting. So I would kind of try and summarize Corinth as a city in real transition. Corinth is kind of a boom city. It's a boom town at the time that Paul visits it. They've just created a way to transport cargo from ships across a small isthmus of land, and thus preventing sailors to have to sail all the way around the southern coast of Greece. So there's a lot of trade happening in Corinth. Corinth is not yet a cultural center like Athens is, but it definitely wants to get into that kind of status. So the city's recently been rebuilt, within several decades of Paul visiting, and it had the most impressive Acropolis in Greece. And so you see this photo here. Some of ancient Corinth is still standing, but it kind of, so if you think about some of the social and economic factors that are coming into play here, what kinds of what kinds of a social landscape are created when new money is flooding into an area where there's a lot of transient workers, and the city has aspirations of becoming the next hot town in southern Greece, right? Well, in the ancient world, Corinth got a reputation for the kinds of things that were happening there. So there was, actually in the Greek of the time, the term "to Corinthianize" meant to kind of live it up. All right. So Corinth was kind of the Las Vegas of the ancient Mediterranean world. What happens in Corinth stays in Corinth, we hope, right? So the temple in Athens was for Athena, right? The goddess of wisdom. The temple in Corinth, does anybody remember what the temple in Corinth was? I feel like I moved too quickly. I'm like, what is it? No, Diana is Ephesus, interestingly, which raises some concerns about the church in Ephesus. But
the temple in Corinth was a temple to Aphrodite, the goddess of lust, right? So if you worship Athena by having a philosophical book club, what do you think you do to worship Aphrodite? We don't want the Zoom call to get too PG-13 here, so we'll just move on. But if you recall Paul writing to the Corinthians and telling them that their body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, it's because he really wanted them to believe that and to stop acting as if their body was a tool or an instrument of their own pleasure. So Corinth is an interesting place. Athens, it was a more sophisticated city. It had a lot going for it, very idolatrous, but Paul was able to look past that. When Paul gets to Corinth, it's a pretty, it's a whole nother level of revulsion, I would say. Let me see, remind me what we've got here in terms of slides. Okay, go back one. Yeah, so I'll just, we're in Acts 18. So this is Luke's description of kind of what Paul encounters as he gets to Corinth, this place that's filled with a lot of new money, rampant, sexual immorality, kind of obsession with celebrity culture, all sorts of like problematic situations. Well, Paul gets there and goes first to the synagogue, Acts 18, verse 5. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I go to the Gentiles." So, no warm welcome among his own people. Now he's just exposed to the terrible Gentiles. These people, right? He's like, these people, I've got to minister to these people. Okay, so there's, Luke actually gives us a lot of detail about Paul's time in Corinth. So we see like Paul does run into Aquila and Priscilla, and Silas and Timothy show up, and that's really great. So he's not by himself, right? He gets a mixed response. So the synagogue doesn't want to have much to do with him. But there are some Gentiles that are listening to him. This is not at all the kind of place that Paul wants to stay, I don't think. But as I indicated earlier, Paul does receive a vision from the Lord in a dream that the Lord wants him to stay there, despite that, right? Things get worse for Paul, right? In terms of being brought before the city authorities. But I think it's worth us kind of slowing down a little bit to think about this year and a half that Paul spends in Corinth. And he's kind of there against his will because the Spirit forces him to stay. So I've just put it in context, like when Paul was in places like Philippi where he didn't really have much to work with, but the gospel took off. And these pagans who didn't have any synagogue to go visit received his message and ran with it, right? Think about all the things that Paul writes to the Philippians. It's a letter full of joy, right? He's in prison, but he's writing to the Philippians with all this great joy. Think about the love, the familial imagery that Paul uses when he writes to the church at Thessalonica, right? Another church in Macedonia, right? These, I kind of think about it through the lens of the Bob Dylan song. Paul is stuck inside of Corinth with the Macedonian blues again, right? He's stuck in Corinth, but he really wants to be back in Macedonia, right? Where he doesn't have to deal with the pride and the the idolatry and the money, of places like Athens and Corinth. So what do we make of Paul's time in Corinth and the fact that he does stay? I think it's really interesting. What do we see Paul doing? Well, Acts chapter 18, verse 11, He stayed 1 year and 6 months teaching the word of God to them. But what's that time like? We know later in his letters to the church of Corinth that Paul took up a very specific posture toward that community. So in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul reminds them that when he was with them, he didn't take a salary. He refused payment from them. He didn't let them pay him. He actually spent his time, I think somebody said this earlier, I can't remember who it was, but he actually spent his time, according to what Luke says in Acts 18, verses 2-4, that after he found Aquila and Priscilla, he started working with them. He got out his old tent making skills. And so I think we have I think there's a photo of the marketplace. Yeah, okay. So this is the one. So this would be, this would be one of the little, I say little, I mean, it's a stone structure here, but a booth off of the marketplace, off of the agora, that would have been a 2-story structure at the time, but it's this kind of dwelling that Paul would have worked out of as he was like spending his days making tents, selling tents, so that he didn't have to earn a living off of the Corinthians. So Paul is staying, Paul's not taking payment from the little church that he started, right? He's actually working, he's working every day in the marketplace. And all that is so that, according to what he tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, he can preach Christ. He can preach the unadulterated gospel without fear as to how it'll be received, right? Think about what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1 and chapters 1 and 2, right? He talks about his own proclamation was made in weakness and with much trembling, right? And he determined to preach Christ and him crucified, and that's it. And what's interesting, what's the backdrop of this, as we know from Paul's defense of his apostleship in 2 Corinthians, is that the people in Corinth, they wanted an intellectual. They wanted a celebrity preacher. They wanted a Greek orator, right? Exactly the kind of person who could stand up on Mars Hill and make his eloquent defense, quoting the poets and philosophers of the native people. Yeah, exactly. They want somebody who's going to, get up and eloquently sell them an idea of the good life. And Paul says, actually, I'm not interested in any of that. He can totally do it. We just saw him do it in Athens, but he's not interested in it, right? He says, I determined to preach one thing, Christ and him crucified. And he says other stuff like the gospel is a stumbling block to the Jews, right? And foolishness to the Gentiles. And the deal, like, you got to think about Corinth as a space, as this boom town with a lot of new money, with a kind of chip on their shoulder. They want to be elite like Athens or some other great Greek city, right? And they got this guy coming, preaching a message, and he just will not bend to their designs for him to be this eloquent celebrity intellectual to make them look good, right? Think about when Paul is talking about the divisions in the church of Corinth, right? You had people that were like, oh, well, I'm of the tribe of Apollos. Well, I'm of the tribe of, that's special. I'm of the tribe of Jesus. It's like people getting into these divisions to kind of achieve some form of religious status. Oh, man. Okay. Yeah, it's like paying to get your kids into a college somewhere, right? So I think, like, I don't know if I have this quote from Campbell, but I'll read it for you if we don't have it. Well, let's listen to Paul in his own words here. This is 1 Corinthians 9. For though I am free from all, I've made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. I've thrown a lot of information at you about Corinth as a very particular place, a place that Paul was not exactly suited to. Are you able to kind of hear his reflection here in 1 Corinthians 9 a little bit differently? Let's reflect on that for a minute. What do you think was involved in Paul getting to a point where he could say something like this?
So I feel like that last verse 23 is key, because it really reminds me of what we discussed last week, where he talks about, where he writes, I may share with them in its blessings, the blessings of the gospel. And I think back of what we discussed about Abraham and the role that God had for him, and the role that Israel had that God had for Israel, for the nations. And it complements very well with that idea of sharing in those blessings with the world, with different, just people from all different walks of life, different backgrounds.
That's great, awesome. Yeah, I totally agree. Who? Jess, what were you gonna say?
I was thinking about your question about how he was able to get to this point. And I thought the passages you've read really illustrated how he really did become all things to whatever audience he was speaking to. And having kind of dug a little deeper and like thinking about how he really did try to relate to his audience. You can when you read these verses, you can I don't know if it's like fully grasp what he was going through, but just maybe get a sense of like, wow, this was like a big undertaking. I don't know. Did you want me to add something?
No, I mean, I think when I read this, it almost seems like he could be to the point of exasperation. Like I've done everything that I can to relate to people. I've become week to meet the week where they are. And yeah, I'm not sure if that's the tone we should be reading this, but that was my first thought when we were reading this now.
Yeah, this is great, guys. I think it's really helpful. I mean, if we had enough time, I think the best thing we could do is just start reading 1 Corinthians and read all the way through 2 Corinthians, because I think once we get a better sense of the history, like the lived history of Paul as a person, as a human being, just like you and me, someone who probably early on in his ministry couldn't say, I put no confidence in the flesh, right? But later in his ministry, and he's writing to the Philippians, chapter 3, he says, I'm getting free of that. I'm getting free of that. I don't put any confidence in the flesh. My flesh, my culture, my heritage, my background doesn't commend me. I don't use that to commend me, right? So this is a lesson for us, certainly. It's a lesson for the watching Corinthian church that had an idea of what knowing Jesus meant, that that needed to go through the cross first, right? But it had a lot it meant to Paul, right? Think about how proud of a man he must have been to boast about persecuting Christians and being there when Stephen was killed, and all that he went through there. And coming from that place and then getting to being formed to the person who could write in 1 Corinthians 10. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved, right? The same guy who just a few chapters later would talk about, what matters above all. 1 Corinthians 13, before it was a text for wedding ceremonies, right? It was the plea of an apostle more than anything. Whether you've got all the gifts, whether you've got all the bells and whistles, what matters more than anything is love for your brother and sister, love for others, right? That did not come natural to Paul, right? God worked that and formed that in him. And when we look closely, we can see that on display. He's not an angel, just like we're not either. Okay,
Yeah,
Ada's jumping in.
I'm just going to jump in a bit here. So Taylor brought up that, 1 Corinthians, chapter 1, verse 22. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. I think that one thing you've seen is that Paul is someone who knows the values of both. He's a Jew and someone who knows Greek wisdom. So he knows the value of both these things, right? So he's not saying these things are invaluable, is that he's come to see the surpassing value of the cross of Christ crucified. So I think it's the dominion of that over all these other things, which I think to some extent he still values, that he hasn't not valued them, right? He understands these things, but they become subjugated. And I think that's like something that's really important, is sort of this process of assertion of the cross over all these things that he's obviously able to refer to, and in some sense that places his trust in. He gets a little continuity of Judaism with Christianity, right, with kind of the science part of it. But it's not like that all these things are no longer, it's not that they were worthless in light of the surpassing value, right? So again, to Ali's point, Abraham, who saw the better country, this is a question of better and surpassing rather than one of like things were unvaluable, because that's not the argument that he's making kind of universally. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, that's good. That's excellent. Hit the next slide. I think, yeah, I just want to throw this in at the end, just for a little bit more of the breadth of what's going on here. So this is from Philippians, the very beginning. So we know, as I said earlier, it's a letter with a lot of joy. Paul has a lot of warm, fuzzy feelings about all his brothers and sisters back in Macedonia, right? But I just want you to think the same guy that wrote this is the one that early on in his ministry in Galatians says, I got in Peter's face. I opposed him to his face about what he was doing with the, right? This is the guy with so much zeal. He was, before he met Jesus, he was invested in hunting down, throwing in prison, or persecuting, torturing, being there when Stephen was murdered. That kind of zeal. At this point, I love this. He said, some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed. That is, in that I rejoice. I'm like, it's so amazing to see him be like, hey, yeah. And I just said he's caught the Spirit. Yeah, he's like, it's just so wild to see him like kind of loose at this point in Philippians, just say, hey, there's some people out there talking about Jesus for the wrong reasons, but hey, I'm just glad Jesus is getting talked about. I think it's amazing. Okay, we're having too much fun here in the podcast studio tonight. Y'all should be here to rein us in. Okay, do you want to do the conclusion, the implications and applications? Do you want me to run with that? What do you want to do? Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, all of this is a really, I think, a fascinating study. I hope it's been fun for you. I mean, good night for Paul to experience all this, and for us all these years later, not to learn from our big brother and not recreate some of his mistakes and all that he had to go through. I think you can stop sharing the slides. I think we're done with slides. Man, it's wonderful to get the chance to kind of have a bird's eye view on his life. But I think we would be really remiss if we didn't spend a little bit of time just reflecting for ourselves on how do we get to a point where we can, like Paul in Philippians 3, say, I put no confidence in the flesh, right? And all the accolades, all the symbols of a, robust identity that I could be proud of, I lay those things aside for whatever Jesus wants to do in and through me. So I'll just give you this prompt. So just take a moment and ask yourself, Paul, we got to listen in on Paul's list of accolades and, all the things that he was proud about. But I want you to take a minute and just ask yourself, this is not a question that you need to necessarily respond to over the mic, but what would you substitute from your own life experience or your own culture in the place of the law? So Paul says in verse 9, he's done trying to achieve a righteousness of his own that comes from the law. Because exactly what Adam said a minute ago, he's encountered the surprising value of just being with Jesus and being united with Jesus, to Jesus' sufferings, and to be used by Jesus and be poured out like Jesus was, right? But in order to get to that place of freedom, there's some things we've got to let go of, right? Or there's some things we've got to loosen our grip on or take a different perspective on. That certainly happens in Paul's life. So what would you substitute from your own life experience or your own culture for what Paul says there? He tried to have a righteousness from the law. What kinds of ways are we trying to achieve a righteousness for ourselves? Might not be from, his background in the law, might be from other things that maybe we need to let go of. And I should clarify that if you feel like it.
Hey, Taylor. So I think I understand your question. I would say from my perspective, I mean, I'm the son of an immigrant and my parents are from the Philippines. So, I mean, the big thing there is, I mean, this is not dissimilar from some cultures, but particularly Asian cultures, the devotion to the family. And I'm just saying beyond the nuclear family. And then, respect for elders within the family, of course. And I think, I've seen it. I haven't been a member of a Filipino church, but I've attended them. And, it's not hard to imagine that some of these cultural idiosyncrasies do make their way into the church. And I think that can be an unhealthy thing. So that was one thing I could think of.
That's a
Something like
great
that.
example.
Yeah, something like that might prevent people from challenging an elder who might be doing something wrong, right? Or something criminal, for that matter. So those kinds of cultural norms are, are in direct conflict with what we'd be expected to do as followers of Christ.
That's a great example, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, the one thing that, I wrote this as Taylor and I are working through this, and I wrote this now. This might be a better joke to some of you than to others, but what struck me is we have the Apostle Paul, we have different names for Paul, the evangelist, but Paul the Pentecostal, right? How often his will had to be bent by the Spirit. And again, like I said, it's like the children's story. You can kind of forget that's all how violent it was, and that he meant that Jesus had to tell him to wake up, like kind of directly. But that he continues to have these visions, these dreams, and it's not a rational man doing rational things, but someone whose rationality and whose identity is being challenged by the Spirit. And so, I mean, it's, each of us have our own lists, but that is something that we can take before the Lord and to the Spirit, right? That this is work that the Spirit did in kind of like probably the most famous single Christian in the history of the world, right? And that it's a humility that we have to accept. That's something that we have to ask for and to follow, right? So that shame is gonna, I think, figures this thing that there is a certain sort of shame that you have to embrace that shame, right? And that's some different things about him, but that like whatever things we have that we know we held on to, maybe we just don't want to think about them or say they're not as bad as they were, or that they're functioning in some way or another, that we can follow Paul's example here, in like in a very serious way, in this interesting way to read his letters as this journey from self-reliance and self-assurance to one of humility. And so like I think it's a question that we should take continuously before God and let the Spirit interrogate us there through these texts, through other texts, and through prayer and through the intervention of other Christians. I think that's been kind of like my takeaway, that as much as his theology is important, I think his testimony, right? If we go back to Hebrews, sort of like the great list of faith. This is like one person as Christians in the great list of faith. And we all know the list of faith isn't one of the success of the people on the list, but the success of the Spirit and God's faithfulness. And this is the way that God is faithful to us, is to reshape us in these sort of small idolatries that we have, right? Or goods that can become bigger than they are. That would be my thoughts on it, more thoughts than any sort of additional question or knowledge or anything like that. So, anybody wants to chime in? I think there are a few more minutes if someone wants to chime in with something that came to mind for them.
I have a question. In that 1 Corinthians 9 that you guys were referring us to, I don't think it's, isn't he kind of just shaming him in the first like 20 some odd verses? So is that a tool for us in the church or what? I'm being sarcastic, of course.
I think it's a great question. Trying to remember the title of it. There's a colleague who teaches at TEDS who just published a book on shame, and its usefulness. Yeah, and its usefulness. So Yeah, I think there's, I think it is interesting that the Corinthians are so proud that Paul has to resort to that, right? But he, I mean, so much of Second Corinthians, which is the kind of doubling down on what you're talking about, Adrian. It's like a lot of it feels like overshare or something. You're like, wow, we're getting a real inside look at how Paul feels about this messed up church and maybe some of the conflicted emotions he's got. But yeah, I think sort of the insight that he has to read the situation and know how much the Corinthians are looking for a celebrity preacher, and then to take, make the courageous stand to say, I might not eat sometimes, but I'm not gonna go down that road. It is something to kind of marvel at for us, I think, certainly. And it, not that we get to learn from his example, but we're not apostles at all in the sense, we are sent on mission, that we're caught up into the mission like Paul, but and this is, maybe this is a good segue to next week. So we spent the first week kind of looking at the missional thrust of the whole of salvation history. We've zoomed in tonight, and there's so many other things that we could talk about. The fact that one of the leading authors of the New Testament did hard time in prison, right? And how much that informs his understanding of the gospel and his embodiment of the gospel. That is not something we hear about much in the evangelical church these days, I'm afraid. Even in a country where we incarcerate more people than have ever been incarcerated in the history of the world. Anyways, so we've zoomed in on Paul's life. There's so many other angles that we could take on this. But what we want to do next week is turn to what theology is there in Paul's message for those of us who are not called to be apostles to the Gentiles. How can we embody and operate with the same kind of global theology, with the same kind of transcultural or multicultural confidence in the gospel and yielding to the Spirit? So that's what we're going to look at as we think about these last 2 weeks of our study. How can we participate more fully? How can we understand this as not just something miraculous that God did in salvation history or in the life of this really extraordinary individual, Paul, but how can we take on this global theology for our understanding today? Is anything you want to? Is that good? Is anything you want to chime in on that?
I think that I think that sums up where we're headed and where we've been. And I guess to just confirm sort of what Adrian said, like that, and Taylor started off saying in the presentation that the message is always the same. How you have to deliver the message is sometimes different. But I think in this context they needed to be shamed, right? But in other contexts, he was looking for. There's things in every culture that can be affirmed, and things in every culture where humility is necessary. And depending on where the people are living in that culture, I think, like meaning where they're really invested, right? Like he couldn't commend that aspect of Corinthian culture, right? They were at that place and at that time, they were subsumed by it, by this sort of status thing. And it was corrupting their idea of Christianity. Like they had already had some sense of things, and it wasn't the church corrupting the church, right? It's kind of a different situation than someone who's new to the gospel. And I think, I guess, for the scope of the course, what he did in Athens and sort of looking for that grain of truth, I think as Susan mentioned, that's something that's true of every culture, right? There's this idea that, and we're getting into something else that we're doing, this might resonate with some people, but this idea, which is a reformed idea, right? That God is still God of a fallen world, that his goodness is not absent anywhere. And I think we're going to start to get that all cultures have something in them that points to the lordship of Christ over the earth. And so there was nothing unique about Athenian culture or Socrates or Plato or Aristotle or the Stoics that made him be able to speak to it. Rather was the unique kingship of Christ over everything that gave Paul a handle in that culture. And so that's true in, pick your most obscure, backwards or a weighted term culture in the world, that there's something of value there because God is still there, right? So I think that's where we're going to start to head, and hopefully open model how we can start to look elsewhere, both as people who are sharing the gospel, but as people who are sharing a world with other Christians and under the worship of God, how we can start to look elsewhere for things that strengthen us in our faith. So yeah, that's the trajectory, and hopefully we'll get there. This week, I hope everybody got the email. I think everybody was included. I'll be sending out another email this week with some resources for this week that we looked back on. So like the books that we mentioned, a couple of podcast interviews that give you kind of a flavor of the books if you're interested in reading them further, and also a few things pointing towards next week for you to reflect on and to think about as we go into week 3. Any questions, or any people didn't get the email? No? I see, all good? All right, thumbs up. All right. All right, so yeah, we'll be sending out, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Susan.
It would be easier if you just put the link back in every invitation so that we don't have to search for it.
Oh, okay, the Zoom link? All right, cool, sounds good. So I'll send that out in a matter of course. Sounds good.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody. See you same time next week. All right.
Thanks. Thanks for hosting us, Chad.
Thanks,
This
guys.
was a really good session. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys.
You'll be getting a Los Dub video too for